She called it a surprise dinner. Those were her exact words, she said. "I have a surprise dinner for you Friday. Wear the blue dress, no questions." I should have asked questions. I have known my friend Camille for 11 years, and in that time I have learned that when she says no questions, she means specifically the questions she does not want to answer, which are always the most important ones. I said fine. I said I would wear the blue dress. I drove to the address she sent me on Friday evening with my hair done and my expectations carefully managed, which is the only way I know how to walk into something when Camille has arranged it. Because her arrangements have a history of being exactly right in ways I could not have anticipated and did not ask for. The restaurant was quiet and warm. The kind of place where the tables are spaced far enough apart that conversations stay private and the candles are real wax, and nobody checks their phone because the room makes that feel wrong somehow. The host took my name and walked me toward a table near the back. I followed him past other couples and a table of 4 celebrating something with champagne. And I was thinking about whether I should have eaten something before I came, because I was hungry in a way that was going to make the first 5 minutes awkward. And then I looked up. He was already seated, dark jacket, reading glasses folded on the table in front of him, a glass of water half gone. The posture of someone who had been waiting long enough to stop trying to look like he had just arrived. He was reading the menu. He had not heard me approaching over the ambient sound of the room. His name was Marcus Hale. He was the CEO of the company I had worked at for 4 years. He looked up. I have thought about what my face did in that moment, and I genuinely cannot reconstruct it with accuracy. I know it was not composed. I know it was the specific face of a person whose brain has encountered a situation for which no preparation was possible. Because who prepares for this? Who sits in their car on a Friday evening, doing their lipstick and thinks, I should emotionally rehearse the possibility that the blind date Camille arranged without telling me who it was turns out to be the man who runs the company where I work. The man who approved my last 2 performance reviews. The man who stood at the front of the all-hands meeting in March and talked about the company's vision for the next 5 years in a way that I had found genuinely convincing, and then thought about on the train home, who I had thought of in the 4 years since I joined, as belonging to a different category of person than the one who shows up at dinner on a Friday and reads the menu with his glasses folded on the table in front of him like a normal human being. He said, Nadia. I said, You're my CEO. He said, I know. I said, Does HR know you're here? His expression did something complicated, a rapid internal negotiation visible only as a slight shift around his eyes. He said, Would you like to sit down before we figure that out? I sat down because the alternative was standing in the middle of the restaurant doing arithmetic I did not have the variables for. The host pulled out the chair with the perfect professionalism of a person who has seen many kinds of things and intends to witness this one with equal neutrality. There was a silence. The candle between us was new and burning steadily and casting exactly the kind of warm, private light that makes situations feel more significant than they might otherwise. He said, Camille is married to my college roommate. I said, Of course she is. He said, She has mentioned you for 3 years. I had no idea you worked at Meridian until I Googled your name this afternoon, approximately 2 hours before the reservation. I looked at him. You Googled my name this afternoon. He said, She gave me a first name and said wear something that isn't a suit. I had 4 hours of notice and no surname. I thought about Camille. I thought about 11 years of friendship and every dinner she had ever arranged and the specific quality of her voice on Tuesday when she said no questions and I had said fine without pushing, which I always do. Because Camille has earned the kind of trust where I stop asking. I said, When you Googled me and saw where I work, why didn't you call her and cancel? He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his water glass. He said, I thought about it for about 20 minutes. And then I decided that if I canceled every situation that was complicated, I would have an uncomplicated and very empty life. He set the glass down. So I came. I looked at him across the candle and the folded reading glasses and the half-finished water. I said, You are my CEO. I am, he said. And you are one of the most recommended people in your division, across 3 separate managers. Which I also found this afternoon, because once I had the company name, it took me approximately 4 minutes to find your internal profile and your last 2 review summaries. He said this without apology, as a fact. Camille had also told me you were exceptional before I had any of that information, so it was more confirmation than surprise. I felt something move through my chest that was warm and also deeply alarming in a way I could not immediately parse. I said, What exactly did Camille tell you before this afternoon? He said, She told me you were the kind of person who gets things right and then doesn't talk about getting them right, which she said was both your most admirable quality and the one that had cost you the most professionally over the years. She told me you had moved to this city from Chicago 3 years ago for a role and had rebuilt your entire life essentially from a suitcase and had done it without complaining to a single person, including her, which she found both impressive and maddening. He paused. She told me you were funnier than you let most people see, and that the last man you were with was intimidated by you, and that you spent 6 months making yourself smaller so he wouldn't be. And she thought you should never have done that. Another pause. She also told me you make very good decisions, and that I should not underestimate that. I was quiet for a moment, not the careful quiet of someone managing their public presentation. The actual kind, where something has arrived that you were not ready for. I said, She has never said any of that to me directly. He said, I think she thought you wouldn't hear it from her the way you needed to. People often need someone else to hold the mirror. The person closest to us is rarely the one who can show us ourselves most clearly. I said, Who holds yours? He said, My daughter. She's 12 and completely without mercy about my blind spots, which is the most useful thing anyone has ever done for me, and also occasionally very difficult at the dinner table. The waiter arrived. We both looked at our menus with the deliberate focus of people who need 30 seconds to locate themselves in a situation that has no map. I ordered the duck. He ordered the lamb. The waiter disappeared. I said, I have to say something to you, and I want you to know I am saying it as a person and not as an employee, which I recognize is an impossible distinction to fully make given what tonight is. He said, Say it. I said, How much do you actually know about what happens in my division on a daily basis? Not the reports. The actual texture of it. He said, More than you might expect, and less than I should. But tell me what you're actually asking. I said, I'm asking because there is something happening in my division that I have been sitting with for 6 weeks, trying to decide whether to escalate it or handle it at the floor level, and I keep choosing to handle it internally, because the escalation path has a complication I couldn't figure out how to navigate, and I just realized that the top of the escalation path is sitting across from me at a dinner table in a restaurant on a Friday evening, and I don't know whether that is a catastrophic coincidence or the only version of this situation where I actually say the thing I need to say. He looked at me steadily. He said, Tell me what's happening. I said, You should know this is not how I operate normally. He said, I believe you. Tell me anyway. So I told him. The short version, because I was aware of where we were and what this dinner was supposed to be. My division had a project manager named Greg Solis, who had been in his role for 2 years and was competent in all the ways that produce clean metrics and deeply problematic in the ways that don't show up in any dashboard. He ran meetings on time. He hit every deliverable. He was pleasant in the hallways. He also had a specific and consistent habit around the 2 most technically skilled women on his team, which was to take their analysis into leadership-facing presentations and present it as his own synthesis, his own conclusions, his own framework. He did it smoothly. He had been doing it long enough that the women themselves had begun to quietly doubt whether what they were experiencing was real or whether they were misreading something, which is exactly the thing that happens when a pattern is consistent enough that it becomes the water you swim in. I had documentation going back 5 weeks. Emails, meeting recordings I had been copied on, a detailed note from one of the women herself who had come to me not to file anything but just to say it out loud to someone she trusted. I had not filed anything because the HR pathway at our company requires you to name your direct manager as a secondary contact. And my direct manager and Greg Solis had been at the company the same number of years and had a collegial relationship I could not see clearly around. And I had spent 6 weeks doing the arithmetic of risk without being able to reach a number I trusted. Marcus Hale listened. He did not interrupt, not once. He did not make the face that some people make when they are about to explain the ways in which what you're describing is more complicated than it seems. The face of someone who is already managing your expectation of the outcome. He listened the way people listen when they are genuinely taking something in, not storing it to respond to, but letting it land and settle. When I finished, he said, "How long have you had documentation?" I said, 5 weeks. I started keeping it the week after the 3rd incident, because by then I understood it was a pattern and not an isolated thing. He said, "And the escalation path concern, it's specifically the manager relationship." I said, "Yes." He said, "Is there anyone besides you who has witnessed what you've documented?" I said 3 people. 1 directly, 2 with context that corroborates the pattern. He said, "Okay." He said it in the tone of someone filing a thing carefully in a place they won't lose it. He did not say anything else about it immediately, and I understood that he was not going to turn the dinner into a deposition, which was a form of judgment I had not expected from him, and felt more than I was ready to name. I said, "I want you to be clear that I didn't bring that up to use the situation. I brought it up because I've been carrying it for 6 weeks, and you asked me what I was really asking, and I gave you the true answer." He said, "I know." He paused. "And for what it's worth, the answer to what you should do is file it. The manager relationship is a complication, but it's not a reason not to. The reason most people don't file things is because they don't trust the system to hold. The only way to find out if the system holds is to put something in it." I said, "That is a different calculation from where you're sitting." He said, "Yes, you're right. That's fair." He didn't qualify it or walk it back. He just sat inside the acknowledgement for a moment. What would make it feel less like a risk? I said, "Knowing the outcome before I filed it." He said, "Nobody gets that. Not even me." He was quiet for a moment. "I filed a complaint against a superior at my 2nd job. I had no idea for 3 weeks whether it would end my time there or not." I said, "What happened?" He said, "He was moved to a different team. It was not the outcome I wanted, and it was what the organization could document and defend. I was angry about it for about a month. And then I understood something that took me a while to see clearly, which is that the filing itself had done something regardless of the immediate outcome. The behavior was on record in a place it could no longer be denied. And the people who had been affected by it had been told formally that what they experienced was real. That couldn't be unmade. I looked at him. I said, "You became a CEO." He said, "Eventually." I said, "Which means the system held for you, at least that far." He said, "The system held partly." And I stayed and tried to build the part of it that hadn't held yet, which is not a guarantee I can offer you. It's just what I chose to do with it. The food arrived. We ate in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have said something real to each other and don't need to immediately fill the space it created. The restaurant continued its warm, indifferent life around us. The candle burned lower. I said, "How long have you been doing this alone?" "With your daughter." He said, 4 years. Her mother and I made the decision together, and it was the right one, and it was also genuinely the hardest thing either of us had navigated, and we are better as the people we are now than we were as the marriage we had. Which is a sentence that takes a long time to be able to say, without it sounding like something you're performing for someone else. I said, "I know that feeling." I said a version of it about my last relationship for about 8 months before it became true instead of something I was rehearsing. He said, "The man who needed you to be smaller." I said, "He wasn't a bad person. He was someone who needed a certain kind of space, and I kept trying to give it to him by shrinking, and it made both of us miserable, and the kindest thing that happened to either of us was when we finally stopped." I paused. 14 months ago. He said, "Which means Camille has been worried about you for 14 months. I said, "And has been saving this particular solution for the right opportunity." "Apparently," he said. "She worries about you the way people worry about someone genuinely irreplaceable." There was something in the way he said it that carried more than the words. The kind of sentence that means two things at once and the person saying it knows it. I looked at the candle for a moment. I said, "You have spent 3 years running a company and apparently thinking about things I did not expect the CEO of a company to think about." He said, "What did you expect me to think about?" I said, "Quarterly projections. Board presentations. The kind of strategic thinking that operates several layers above what is happening on individual project teams on a Tuesday afternoon." He said, "I think about all of those things. I also think that a company is its people, and how people are treated inside it is the actual strategy, and every other thing is downstream of that. This is not a noble belief. It is a practical one, based on watching what happens when it isn't true." He looked at me. Whether I'm getting it right at Meridian is a question I genuinely cannot answer from where I sit. That is partly why I needed you to tell me about Greg Solis. I said, "Needed." He said, "Needed, past tense, present tense, true." I looked at him. Outside the window, the street was quiet in the way that city streets go quiet past 9 on a Friday. The evening's energy pulled inside somewhere. The surfaces left holding only reflected light. I said, "How do you know what you don't know?" "From where you sit. The things that don't make it into the reports." He said, "I don't, most of the time." That's the honest answer. The higher up you sit in a company, the more you are surrounded by information that has been curated before it reaches you. And the curation is not always dishonest. It's just the way information moves through systems. It smooths as it travels. By the time something has been through 3 layers of management and 2 rounds of summarizing, what arrives on my desk is a version of the situation, rather than the situation itself. He set down his fork. What I try to do is stay close enough to the actual work that I notice when the version I'm getting and the version that is true have stopped matching. I don't always catch it. Tonight I caught something I would not have caught any other way. I said, "You're not going to be able to unknow it." He said, "No. And I don't want to." I said, "It's going to be in the room the next time I'm in a meeting you're in." He said, "Yes, and what I need you to understand about that is that it is not going to change the way I see your work. Because your work was already documented, and your track record is already what it is, and neither of those things were affected by this dinner. What this dinner did was give me information I needed to do my job correctly, and the fact that I received it across a candlelit table from someone Camille has been telling me about for 3 years is the particular texture of how it arrived, not the thing itself." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "You've thought about that?" He said, "I thought about it on the drive here, before I knew who you were. I thought about what it would mean to have a dinner with someone my college roommate's wife had been recommending for 3 years. Someone she was clearly attached to in the way she gets attached to people she believes in, and what my responsibility was in that situation. How to be present for what the evening actually was rather than what I might want it to be." He paused. "I just didn't account for the specific variable that arrived when you walked in." I said, "The part where I work for you." He said, "Yes. That part required some rapid recalibration." I said, "How long did the recalibration take?" He said, "About the length of time between when you sat down and when you said, 'Does HR know you're here?' Which made me think that whatever this evening was going to be, it was going to require me to be more honest than I had planned on." The waiter appeared and asked about dessert. We both said yes, without looking at the menu. We got the chocolate thing. We ate it slowly, and the conversation moved in a different direction, away from the professional terrain and into the quieter personal landscape where you find out what a person is actually made of when the formal version has been set aside. He told me about his daughter, whose name was Iris, who had his stubbornness and her mother's particular gift for reading people, and who had recently informed him, during a Tuesday breakfast while he was still reading emails, that he was demonstrably better at running a company than he was at being present at the breakfast table, and that he should probably do something about the second one before she was too old for it to matter. He said he had heard it the way you hear the thing you already knew but needed someone to say out loud. He said he had been trying since then. I asked what trying looked like in practice. He said it looked like being on time to things that mattered to her, not checking his phone until she was asleep, and learning to cook 2 things well so that meals felt chosen rather than managed. He had spent 3 weekends learning a risotto and a pasta with lemon and breadcrumbs that Iris had declared acceptable, which in her vocabulary meant she would eat it a second time without being asked, and occasionally a third time if it had been a good week. I said, "She sounds like she knows exactly what she wants." He said, "She has always known exactly what she wants. When she was 6, she told her kindergarten teacher that the classroom rules were mostly good, but the lining up policy was inefficient, and she had a suggestion. The teacher called me. I told her that Iris was probably right about the lining up policy. He looked at something slightly past me, the soft expression of a person seeing a memory they like. "She keeps me honest. It is the most important thing anyone does for me." I said, "She sounds like she does what Camille does. Holds the thing you need to see until you're ready to see it." He said, "Exactly that. Different method. Same result." I said, "How long did it take you to understand that that's what she was doing?" He said, "About 2 years. Which is also how long it took me to stop being defensive about it." I told him about Chicago, the person I had been there, the particular quality of that city and the job that had brought me here, and the year after the move when the job changed shape in ways I hadn't expected, and I'd had to decide whether the city I had come to for a role was the city I was willing to stay in for reasons that had nothing to do with the role. It had not been a simple decision. There were 6 months in the middle of that year where I had 1 foot in each answer and could not commit to either. going back to Chicago on weekends to see people who felt like evidence of the life I'd left, coming back Sunday evenings to an apartment that was organized, but not yet home. The decision to stay had not happened in a single moment. It had accumulated, the way that most real decisions do, in the small daily choices that add up to a direction before you've formally named it. He said, "What was the moment you knew you'd stayed?" I said, "I stopped going back every weekend. Not because I didn't love those people, but because I realized I was going back to feel like myself, and I had slowly become more myself here than I'd expected. And when I noticed that, I understood I'd already made the decision some time earlier and just hadn't filed the paperwork on it internally." He said, "The decision preceding the awareness of it." I said, "Yes." Which is actually how most things work, I think. The knowing comes after the doing, if you're paying attention. He looked at me for a moment, with the expression of someone encountering a thought they want to keep. He said, "Which version of yourself did you bring to Meridian?" I said, "The one who had already decided to stop waiting for external permission to be the full version. The one who had built the life from scratch and understood that the building itself was the credential." He said, "That tracks exactly with what I read in your reviews." I said, "What do the reviews say?" He said, "That you ask the right questions and that you do it in rooms where not everyone is comfortable with that, and that you do it anyway, consistently, without adjusting the questions downward to make the room more comfortable." He paused. "That specific quality is rarer than it should be at any level of an organization, and it becomes rarer as you move up because the rooms get more comfortable and the pressure to maintain that comfort increases." He looked at me. "Don't let it become rare in you. Whatever else happens." I looked at him. I said, "You say that like you're worried it might." He said, "I say it because I have watched it happen to very good people, and I think you are a very good person. And I would rather say it once clearly than not say it." The check arrived, and he settled it before I could introduce the conversation about splitting it, which I filed away without comment because I was using all available processing capacity for the rest of what the evening had become, and some negotiations genuinely have to wait. The check arrived, and he settled it before I could introduce the conversation about splitting it, which I noted and let go because I was using all available processing capacity for the rest of the evening, and some negotiations have to wait. Outside, the air had gone genuinely cold, October doing the thing it does past 9, where the temperature drops faster than the light, and the street had that late weekend hush where the city has pulled itself into smaller, warmer spaces. He walked with me to my car. We stopped at the corner, and neither of us said anything right away. A gust moved through the street, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your scarf, and I pulled my coat tighter, and he looked at me with the expression of someone deciding whether to say the last honest thing or hold it back for the sake of being careful. He said, "File it Monday. I am going to look at what has been documented from your division in the past 18 months and notice a pattern independently. That is how this works when the system is functioning. Someone holds the door open from the inside." I looked at him. He said, "You didn't tell me anything at dinner tonight. We have not met before. You have decided, independently, to use the standard process." He said it plainly, without theater. "What you put in writing will be taken seriously. I am telling you that so that you can put it down, the thing you have been carrying, and trust that what comes next is not going to undo you." I said, "You didn't have to say that." He said, "You've been holding it for 6 weeks. I'm not going to let you drive home still carrying all of it, if I can do something about that." We stood there for another moment in the cold. I thought about 6 weeks of documentation and the careful daily arithmetic of who to trust and what the risk actually was, and the specific loneliness of knowing something true that you cannot yet say out loud. He said, "I would like to do this again. Different restaurant. None of the professional excavation in the second act." I said, "I work for you." He said, "I know that. And I am not going to pretend the complication isn't real." He looked at me steadily. "I am also not going to pretend that tonight was ordinary. It wasn't. And I don't have a clean way to say that without sounding like a cliché. So I'm just going to say it plainly and let you decide what to do with it." I said, "Say it plainly." He said, "I came here tonight expecting a first date, and I found something I was not prepared for. Which is a conversation I haven't had in a long time with someone who told me the truth about a hard thing, and then kept being interesting after that. And Camille told me I shouldn't underestimate your decisions, and I'm choosing not to." I looked at him. I said, "That is a considerable amount to put on a single dinner." He said, "I've been told I do that." I said, "By Iris." He said, "Mostly by Iris." I drove home with the windows cracked even though it was cold. That is what I do when I need the air to move through the thinking with me, when the thoughts are too present to be inside a sealed space. I made every light from the restaurant to my building, which felt like the city making a small accommodation on a night that had already required more of me than I had expected to give. I thought about the evening in order. I thought about a man looking up from a menu and the specific quality of impossibility in that moment before I understood what I was looking at. I thought about what he had said about filing the complaint at his second job. The 3 weeks of not knowing, the outcome that was not what he wanted, and that turned out to matter anyway, because the record existed in a place it could not be denied. I thought about Camille telling a near stranger that I make very good decisions, holding that for 3 years, waiting for the right room to put it in. I filed the complaint on Monday at 9:17 in the morning. I had spent Sunday afternoon going through the documentation one final time, not adding to it, not revising it, just reading the full shape of what I had built across 5 weeks with the eye of someone who has decided to act rather than the eye of someone still deciding. It looked different from that angle. Clearer. Less like a risk and more like the most accurate description of something that had been true all along, waiting to be named in a form the system could receive. I submitted it through the standard process, named the 3 witnesses, attached the complete timeline, described what I had observed without editorial and without softening, in the plain language of a person reporting a pattern and not a grievance. I clicked send, and then I closed my laptop, and I went to get coffee, and I stood in the kitchen at the end of my floor for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock on the microwave before I could go back to my desk. The doing of it had taken something that I had been holding in reserve for 6 weeks and used it up, and I needed the 11 minutes to understand that I was not diminished by the using. I was lighter. The process took 2 weeks. I heard nothing during those 2 weeks, which I had been told to expect, and which was still its own particular tension, the kind that lives behind everything you do without announcing itself, surfacing in the 10 seconds before you open your email in the morning, and the moment before you walk into any meeting that includes people who were named in the filing. I did my work. I asked the right questions in the rooms that needed them. I did not tell anyone what I had done except the 3 witnesses, who already knew, and Camille, who said, "Finally," in a tone that communicated both complete support and mild exasperation at the timeline. 2 weeks later, Greg Solis was moved to a different team. The email came from HR on a Thursday afternoon, and it was phrased in the careful, neutral language that organizations use when they are doing a thing they want to do, without generating documentation of why. And I read it 3 times, and then I set my phone down and looked at the window for a while. It was not everything I had wanted. I had wanted something that was named more clearly, something that would be on a record that the two women could point to specifically, something that felt commensurate with 5 weeks of watching a pattern that had probably been running for much longer than that. What arrived was a structural change that removed the immediate harm and generated no public acknowledgement of why. I spent 3 days inside the gap between what I had wanted and what had happened, which is a gap I recognized from other parts of my life. The particular frustration of a system that does the right thing in the minimum necessary way. And then, on the 4th day, one of the women on Greg Solis's former team sent me a message through our internal platform. It said, simply, "I heard what happened. I don't know what you did or how, but I want you to know I feel like I can breathe again." She sent it at 11:40 at night, which told me she had been thinking about it for a while before she sent it. I read it once, and then again. And then I understood what Marcus had described about the filing mattering beyond the immediate consequence. Because what the filing had done, regardless of the outcome that arrived in careful neutral language on a Thursday afternoon, was put something into the record in a place it could not be denied, and give someone the language to feel that what she had experienced had been seen. That was the main thing. That was the thing that could not be unmade. I texted Camille that Wednesday evening, not about Marcus, about Greg Solis, and she wrote back 3 minutes later, "I know. I'm proud of you. You were never too small for any of this. You were just waiting to be sure enough." I called her. She answered on the second ring and said immediately, before I could say anything, "How was it?" I said, "How was what?" She said, "Nadia." I said, "It was the strangest dinner I have ever had." She said, "Strange is how you know something is real. I arranged it specifically because I thought you were ready, and I was right." She was right. I did not say so because she is already operating at a level of self-assurance that confirmation cannot improve. But she was right, and she had been right for 3 years and had been patient enough to wait until the moment was correct. Marcus and I had dinner again 3 weeks later, at a smaller place with no professional crisis in the middle of it, and the conversation was the same quality as the first one, which I had not been entirely sure would survive the removal of the unusual circumstances. It did. He told me things about the company he runs and the things he had gotten wrong and the things he was still trying to understand, and I told him things about who I had been in Chicago and who I had decided to become on the other side of the move, and at no point did either of us check the phone or look at the door. He said, "At the end of it, Camille told me not to underestimate your decisions." I said, "She also arranged a blind date between a company's CEO and one of its employees without telling either of them, so her judgment is not without its complications." He said, and yet. That is the truest thing about all of it. Two people who ended up across from each other in a situation that had no script and no preparation and no category, who both decided in the first 5 minutes to stay and figure it out rather than leave and be safe. He stayed because he had already decided that uncomplicated and empty was not the life he was building. I stayed because I was wearing the blue dress, and something in my body made the decision before my brain finished the calculation, and sometimes the body is simply ahead of the rest. What I know now that I did not know on the Friday I drove to that restaurant with my expectations carefully held in place is this: the things that are worth something almost never arrive in the form you prepared for. They arrive in the form of a man you already know reading a menu with his glasses on the table. In the form of a friend who has been holding a mirror you weren't ready for until she decided you were. In the form of a conversation that turns out to be exactly as important as it felt in the moment, rather than less important the next morning, which is not usually how things work, but is occasionally and specifically how this one did. The record exists. The women on that team know they were seen. I am still at the company, still doing the work, still asking the right questions in rooms where not everyone is comfortable with that. And I have stopped waiting for permission to be the full version. Camille takes all the credit. I am letting her have it. She has earned it in this instance specifically, and I intend to make her pay for it in every other way for the rest of our friendship. Have you ever walked into a room expecting one thing and found something you could not have prepared for? Something that asked more of you than you thought you had available and turned out to be exactly the thing you had been slowly moving toward without knowing what it was? Have you ever had a moment where the most complicated situation was also, underneath everything, the most honest one you had ever been inside?